Hi. Before we begin, I'm actually back in Verstappen this year. Keep that in mind with what you hear from this point on. This isn't a PR campaign for Hamilton by any means, but recent events have brought me to write it. When you sit down to watch F1 these days, do you wish to see Hamilton have a few setbacks to see him properly fight for his victories? Do you hate how much he and Mercedes have dominated F1 as of late? Is Max Verstappen your new shining hope against the monotony of back-to-back Mercedes titles? If you said yes to any of that, that's fine, that's reasonable. I confess to some of these too, but amidst the desire for closer competition, I still hold Hamilton himself in the highest favour. In the heat of the 2021 battle with Verstappen, I've seen some really depressing sentiment levelled towards Hamilton by the fans completely undeservedly from many sides. What follows now is why I think that actually Lewis Hamilton was the ideal person to become the most successful motorsports athlete of all time, and why we're actually pretty lucky to have him as the global figurehead of the sport. Now, I say this as both a supporter and denigrator of Lewis at times. In 2007 and 2008, when Hamilton was toppling the establishment of the sport in his first appearances, it was absolutely fantastic to witness. In those early campaigns, he was ruthless and rapid, fighting for greatness, suffering major setbacks, team drama, and even horrifying, undeniable racism at times. If you're new to F1 and you're not aware of those incidents, then I urge you to look it up, as it provides so much context for why Lewis is who he is today. Believe it or not, to me, Hamilton actually seems at heart to be quite shy and a fairly vulnerable person, with more in common with the average bloke beneath the paparazzi photos and such. But he now has a suit of armour unlike nothing else. He can stand in front of the world and say that he is the most successful F1 athlete of all time. His transformation from a reserved character when he first joined F1 to a now expressive guy that lives confidently and without fear is proof of this galvanising fact working. Now, I don't want to overblow it. There's no doubt that the majority of the Hamilton hate actually comes from a place of boredom and frustration that F1 has been ruled by Mercedes for far too long, with one name at the top far too often for anyone's liking. I understand this completely. I also plugged into this sentiment in recent years, but this isn't just an F1 problem, nor is it a Hamilton problem. Fans of any sport, be it football or tennis or whatever, inevitably start hoping for a usurper to rise up and topple the current holder of the throne. It's always exciting to witness a transfer of power at the top of any sport. Being the king of a hill means that you will attract more scrutiny. That's a given. But what reasons do some people, including fellow Brits, give for their criticism or dislike of Hamilton himself? He didn't work his way up as a rookie. Some folks devalue Hamilton as a driver because he was placed in a competitive car from the beginning. This is true. He didn't have to endure a stint in a slower car for a year or two like pretty much every other rookie does, and it would be a good point if not for the fact that he absolutely did it justice. Many drivers get bumped up to top teams after a year or two acclimatising to F1 and then just wither under the spotlight. Hamilton being placed in a top team from the start was actually arguably a more brutal baptism than a rookie typically undergoes. A real sudden death scenario. Succeeding would be spectacular, failure would be scarring forever. If there was a new driver introduced to F1 today and they were placed alongside Verstappen for his rookie season, people would already be out digging his metaphorical grave. Imagine then if that new rookie was matching and at times beating Verstappen. Such a driver would be seen as heroically talented, yet this is exactly how Hamilton introduced himself to the world of F1 alongside double world champion Alonso, and it was amazing to witness. Sometimes I think this needs to be remembered when you talk about Hamilton as a driver today. He proved himself from the start. He's always had the fastest car. Of all the things said to degrade Hamilton's success, this is probably by far the most objectively valid. It's a hard fact for much of his career. Although Lewis wasn't in the top car between 2009 and 2013, since 2014 he's been in the best car. That's 7 unbroken years of victory for Mercedes. At this point we know Hamilton is blazing quick, he always has been. But what Mercedes' dominance has done is rob us of regular chances to see him really fight anyone but Bottas on the odd occasion. Everyone wants to see the champion at work, not just driving clean air out in front, and this fuels that frustration. There's a part of me that wants Hamilton to switch to a midfield team so he can fight for positions consistently, and although we've seen how many times Hamilton can slice through the field in a recovery drive quite easily comparative to Bottas in the same machinery, it's not quite what we're after. Mercedes' decision to stick with Bottas for so long, despite clearly not being able to match Hamilton, has also taken the teeth out of F1 for years, and we've all pined for them to just drop in a teammate that Lewis can spar with. But this is not Hamilton's fault. Thankfully, 2021 has put this right, with Red Bull finally squaring up to Merc. I've thought to myself before that if I was Hamilton, I'd switch to a lower team to really prove that I can race, and it's not just for car. But then I also think to myself, why would I do that? Just to silence my critics, when I've got a wonderful team that I've grown so close to. It would be a type of betrayal to leave them when they've done nothing wrong, and I would be the first F1 driver to leave a team that I love and who clearly loves me back. And then I remember that Lewis did once do exactly what I described. When he left second place for Constructors McLaren for fifth place Constructors Mercedes for 2013, a lot of people saw this as a bad, illogical decision. In the following year, Mercedes improved to place second in the Constructors' Championship above McLaren, before the turbo engine introduction in 2014, which finally cemented Mercedes as the new front runners, but we all know that. Point being, if you enjoyed working with your team, would you leave just because a minority of people are still not convinced that you, a 7-time world champion, really earned it? Personally, I'll tell you to do one. He's bringing politics into F1. Now, politics has been in F1 forever, but some resent Hamilton because since 2019-ish, he's been pretty vocal about those pesky lefty activist causes such as environmentalism, racial equality, human rights, animal rights, and so on. He's accused of hypocrisy by preaching these things and simultaneously driving and taking part in F1, which itself pollutes and panders to countries that maybe don't fit the ideal. This new focus gave rise to a new angle of criticism for some. One popular vector of attack concerns Hamilton's private jet, which he owned up until 2019 and then sold to reduce his carbon footprint. When you've got such a large global platform and following like Hamilton currently does, you can say almost anything you want. Of all the things he could do with that platform, giving voice to these causes is far from the worst thing he could be doing. I think many of us would try and do the same thing with this kind of influence. Initially, we'd just soak up the stardom and fame for a bit, then eventually after that novelty wears off, we'd settle back down and figure out our own values. Vettel has wholeheartedly joined forces with Hamilton in the kind of equality messages being conveyed, clearly because he too is no longer worried about what people think of him, and it's made Seb a more likeable character to many. If you dislike Hamilton for this reason, would you rather he say nothing and not even try to deflect this slice of the world towards more equal and sustainable ground? The argument of all or nothing is a paralysing mindset, and it's one that you often see in critics' arguments, not just about this, but lots of things in life, in every subject. Something is always better than nothing, and the fact that there was a marked, organised pushback against the horrendous comments on social media after the Silverstone collision with Max Verstappen goes to show that Hamilton's efforts are actually making a difference. Fact is, whenever people stick their neck out, they will attract criticism for it. Hating on him for choosing these issues out of everything he could possibly choose to say or do is kind of harsh. He loves himself too much. Now, some dislike Hamilton because they see him as having an ego, or that he acts a bit holier than thou. To them, I say, I kind of see your point. From some angles, Hamilton could come across in this way, especially if you just read news about him in certain UK trash papers. And I too thought this at one point, but the more I reflected on it, the more I could see that that's not really the case. Compared to the top athletes in other sports, Hamilton actually keeps a fairly low profile. He's probably one of the most respectful drivers towards his colleagues on track as well. I can't remember Hamilton ever coming up to another driver and squaring up to them, trying to humiliate them in the paddock like some of them have been known to do. I don't recall him dressing anyone else down or attacking their character in interviews, even informally. I've never known him to give, rude hand gestures at the cockpit or go nuts on the radio like you often see from other drivers. For the most part, he appears to have one of the calmest and mature heads in the grid. And think back to the hostile and hateful environment Hamilton sometimes found himself in during the early F1 years, when he was raining on Alonso's parade in his rookie season. And this is just what we, the public, could see with our own eyes. He talks a lot about feeling ostracised as a racial minority in the world of motorsport from a young age, and although it's hardly the same, anyone who's experienced bullying can see a slice of themselves in Hamilton's attitude of keeping your head down and letting what you achieve speak for you until you've mostly silenced your opponents. If you're a driven person and you experience hostility, you tend to raise your guard, put all of your energy into your talent, and focus on succeeding until your achievements become your suit of armour, your own sanctuary. This to me explains why Hamilton now, after so much victory, feels free to just be himself. I know for a fact that if I was in his position and I had to face the kind of critical headwind that Hamilton gets, I would be a lot less restrained in my own defence. If Hamilton really had the ego that they love to label him with, we'd know about it. I can only suggest that this angle of criticism stems from just not watching enough F1 and getting to know the guy. Hamilton didn't deserve a knighthood. Now, this is a really easy one to sink because it's just flat out unjustified. And if you're not from the UK and you're unfamiliar with what a knighthood is, I'll explain. A knighthood is essentially a ceremonial title given to British people of prominence that have given exceptional service to the United Kingdom, be it cultural, sporting, societal, etc. Lewis Hamilton's official title is Sir Lewis Hamilton, thanks to being given this knighthood. Some recognisable knighthood holders include Michael Caine, Patrick Stewart, Elton John, and Tom Jones, for example. So to all you non-K viewers, imagine a British racing driver wins 7 F1 world titles and proceeds to put a British name firmly at the top of Formula 1 history books for years to come. What do you think the reaction of the British public was to this driver receiving a knighthood and royal recognition from the British monarchy? If you guessed unanimous agreement and appreciation for giving the nation something to be proud of, you'd be wrong. I have never seen a British sportsman bring so much success and victory to this nation and get so trashed and denigrated by a portion of his own countrymen. It just doesn't make sense at all, and it's the homegrown hate that I will never see eye to eye with. The bloke is literally sticking the Union Jack on the top race after race, but despite the fact that being the best in the world is what British people yearn for in all other sports, somehow this just isn't good enough for some people. So, it's obvious to anyone paying attention that Hamilton is held to a far higher standard than anyone else on the grid, as is customary for the dominant competitor in any sport. If Norris or Leclerc make a huge mistake, it's condolences and ruffling of hair all around, never mind sport, get him next time. If Hamilton makes a mistake, I can guarantee I'll flick open social media and read endless ridicule and mocking, pointing comments firing out from all sides. Indeed, if you look at this stuff too often, it can get nasty and a bit depressing. And at the time of recording, the last race I watched was a Hungarian Grand Prix, where all sorts of crazy stuff happened, but like so many times before, Hamilton found himself with the task of getting as high up the order as possible from the back end of the grid, following an unlucky strategy call. We've witnessed this many times, where Lewis manages to salvage a podium or even a win from unrealistic circumstances by setting consistently blazing pace. For other drivers, such a recovery drive would be an automatic driver of the day vote straight away, but for Hamilton it seems to be a typical Sunday. During the post-race interviews at Hungary 2021, his name was met with a blanket of boos and whistles from the crowd as he stood visibly dazed, exhausted and close to passing out. As I watched Lewis's face turn drearily to the hostile crowd whilst he tried to listen to the broadcaster's questions, it just seemed really shameful, especially sandwiched between a huge cheers for Ocon's first win and Vettel's surprise podium. At that point it was more of a jeering mob than a crowd. For context, in the race previous to this, Hamilton and Verstappen collided at Silverstone, igniting a backlash against Hamilton, which no doubt was the foundation for much of the crowd's anger. That incident highlights which way the wind is currently blowing amongst public sentiment, and I feel like this is another classic case of not knowing what you have until it's gone. When Hamilton eventually is no longer a dominant force in F1, just like Vettel before him and Schumacher before him, the sharper edges of public opinion will go away and he'll be remembered fondly for his unparalleled success in F1 and his barnstorming entrance to the sport, missing out on a championship in his rookie year by a single point. For the time being, Hamilton's act is so polished that there are no obvious cracks or gaps for the highly pressured atmosphere of criticism to get in, so even the slightest misstep is blown out of proportion, and people will take almost anything if it helps them justify chucking a hateful comment under a post or a news article. It's reasonable to hate how F1 has been a foregone conclusion for so long now. It's reasonable to hate how it's always the same name on top year after year until now. I've also been hoping for a fresh challenge for a long time, and now we finally have it. But in the process of rooting for Verstappen this year, I will know full well that Hamilton has carried the global motorsports crown with a high level of dignity. Maybe Lewis is just too clean-cut and perfect for some, but after he's moved on from F1 and a less restrained champion takes his place, they might just miss him. That's all I've got to say on it for now. Maybe I'm mischaracterising some folks' reasons for disliking Hamilton, but in any case, I hope one day we can see an end to the hate.